And the next presenter is Mary Beth Moss. She's quite an accomplished person, and I believe that Huna has really benefited from her presence amongst us, and it goes back quite a few years, I know. She was in resource management for the Glacier Bay National Park for many years, and then she was on the cutting edge of the relationship with the Huna Tlingit. She was there through the place names, I know. We had some very trying moments, and she sat through it all. And she went through a physical difficulty there for a while, and she had to move from the Park Service, and as luck would have it, Huna Indian Association picked her up, and she is a very valuable resource person. Right now we are both using her, the National Park Service and the tribe are using her for our return to Kwatani, and that will be her presentation. Mary Beth.
As Ken said, I left the Park Service. I was the resource manager for Glacier Bay National Park for 10 years. I took a very exciting, short, dramatic hang gliding flight and ended up in the side of a mountain, and thus ended my hang gliding career. And it also gave me the opportunity, though, to take a look at what I wanted to do with my future. So I see it in the long run as a tremendous blessing for me. It led to my early retirement from the National Park Service and a move over to Huna, where I work with the Huna Indian Association. I'm actually now back on the Park Service payroll to work on a project that I started as a Park Service employee 10 years ago, and that is the project to reauthorize the collection of gull eggs in Glacier Bay National Park, and that's what I'll be talking about today. I want to thank especially the Mills family, who lent me some really wonderful historic slides of some of their family outings to collect eggs in Glacier Bay, and particularly I want to thank the Huna elders who provided incredible cultural knowledge about the traditional activity of gull egg collecting. And I also want to thank them for their incredible patience. I said that this process has taken 10 years. It's not done yet. We're hoping that by next year folks will be picking eggs in Glacier Bay, but we're not totally there yet. And I'm sure for the elders and for any of the folks in Huna who have been waiting for that taste of gull eggs, it's felt like 9,000 years, and I'm just becoming appreciating that more and more as I spend time in the community of Huna. So I don't need to belabor the point. Glacier Bay is obviously Huna territory. And egg harvest has occurred in Glacier Bay for thousands of years. Ken gave a little bit of a description of the advance and retreat of the glaciers, and what happened when the glaciers retreated in Glacier Bay. It left this wonderful habitat for gulls to nest in. Gulls like to nest in open, sort of grassy territory, and so the retreat of the glaciers left plenty of that. As recently as the 1950s, there were 800 dozen eggs taken from Glacier Bay. That's quite an Easter. So lots and lots of eggs. It was a very, very productive egg harvest area. Unfortunately, in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed, and I say unfortunately. I'm a biologist by training, so there are aspects of this law that I appreciate. I also recognize that it's caused a lot of hardship for Native people. One of the results of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is that it made it illegal to harvest the eggs, feathers, or any parts of migratory birds. And yes, gulls are considered migratory birds, although many of you will say, well, heck, they're here all year round. They are technically classified as migratory birds. Go figure, I don't know. Also, National Park Service regulations prohibit the removal of any living items from the park, and or parts like nests and antlers, parts of living or previously living creatures. So when the park was established, or the monument first in 1925, that regulation also precluded the taking of gull eggs in the park. Ken did mention that eggs were the Park Service allowed eggs to be harvested into the 1960s. There was a lot of confusion in the Park Service, and there was also a hesitancy on the part of the Park Service to stop an activity that some people within the Park Service recognized as a traditional activity. These laws, however, led to what many people in Hoona call the second ice age. This was what people in Hoona perceived to be the freezing out of native people from Glacier Bay National Park. Their beloved homeland, people felt that they could not come to gather their traditional foods, gull eggs or seals, and led to a long-term very, very difficult relationship, very painful relationship between the federal officials in Glacier Bay, who perceived themselves to be stewards of the land, and the Hoona Tlingit people, who are the real stewards of that landscape. I came on in 1993, and I still felt, even then in 1993, the pain of that second ice age, that very difficult, strained relationship. By 1997, I had been able to hire Wayne Howell, who many of you know, a very wonderful man who's been working with the National Park Service since 1996 in the capacity as a cultural resource manager. And he and I brainstormed a workshop, a traditional ecological knowledge workshop, where we brought some of the elders over from Hoona. We invited them over to Glacier Bay, their homeland, and asked them to share some of their traditional knowledge with us. Wow, were we naive. We were incredibly naive. We thought that we could just invite people back and ask them to open up and share their knowledge with us. And we didn't realize the depth of the pain that folks had experienced from this ice age, this having been frozen out from Glacier Bay. What we heard resoundingly from people at that meeting was, before we will begin a relationship with you, we want three things. First thing we want is the ability to come and harvest gull eggs in Glacier Bay, in our homeland. Secondly, we want the ability to come and harvest seals. And third, we would like to be able to come and harvest mountain goat. The Park Service superintendent at the time, Jim Brady, made a commitment to the Hoona people that he would explore options for all three of those activities. And he asked Wayne and myself to focus on the first activity, gull egg harvest. What Wayne and I planned was a strategy where we would combine the use of traditional knowledge from the Hoona elders and science. We knew that while the Hoona people wanted to come and gather eggs, we knew that there were some conservation groups, some environmental groups that might have concerns about authorizing that kind of activity in a national park. So we wanted to get all of our ducks in a row, all of our seagulls in a row. All of our eggs in the basket. So we planned a two-pronged approach. We contracted with some anthropologists, Tom Thornton. Most of you probably know Tom. Tom and Dr. Hun and Priscilla Russell and Daryl Johnson from Seattle, from Washington State, University of Washington, did a gull egg ethnography starting in 1998. And we also contracted with the USGS Biological Survey to do a 2-year biological study of the potential effects of harvest on gulls. So the ethnography, and I'm not going to go into lots of details about this. There are 2 publications, or two reports that resulted from this study, and then some journal publications. And also you have the man himself here, Tom Thornton, that can give you details on that study later on. But basically what Tom and Dr. Hun looked at was they asked folks in Hoona to share with them information about where eggs were harvested traditionally, what species were harvested, when they were harvested, how eggs were harvested, were all the eggs from a nest collected or only some of them, that sort of thing. And then they also gathered information on the physical, social, cultural, and spiritual values associated with egg collecting. Again, this is not going to be news to most of you. Gull egg collecting, of course, the results of the study were that gull egg collecting is vitally important to the identity of the Hoona Tlingit people. First, it's new, spring, fresh food. It's one of the first foods that people in Hoona and Tlingit people in other locations, they look to for a new awakening, a chance to eat something different than the dried food or jarred food that they've been eating all winter. Obviously, it's also a very healthy source of protein, and particularly in this day and age, dietitians and doctors are urging Native people to go back to eating their traditional foods because of the health of those foods. So that came out in the study. The process or the activity of going up to collect eggs was a really special time for families to bond. People didn't tend to go individually to collect eggs. It was entire families that would go. And I'm seeing folks in the audience nod. I'm sure many of you went with your families. This is the Mills brothers, and you can just see the look on these boys' faces that they were thrilled to go spend time with their family. It was a treat. It was a chance for young kids to participate in a subsistence activity. They might not be old enough to go fishing with their fathers. They might not be old enough to handle a firearm, but they could sure find a gull egg and collect that and feel good about contributing to their family's well-being. It was an opportunity for elders to transmit lessons, moral lessons or cultural lessons to young people. And this is Phyllis Mills with her first egg, and she obviously just again looks thrilled to have that first egg. This is Ken picking an egg, authorized by the Park Service to do so. He put it back. For folks living in Hoona, quite a bit of distance from their homeland of Glacier Bay, the egg gathering activities, it was an opportunity for people to connect with their precious homeland, with the place that their ancestors lived and still live. And last, this has become very powerful for me because my daughter is Ducktain Tan. She will be a seagull gal at some point. But seagulls are the very identity of the Ducktain Tan clan. The clan crest, the seagull, defines the Ducktain Tan people. And so I think that the Hoona folks have that really special tie to seagulls because of the Ducktain Tan people. So those were the results of the ethnographic study, and again, that's nothing new to most of you, especially those of you who grew up collecting eggs. The biological study looked at the number of eggs that birds laid, the number of eggs that were relayed, number of eggs that hatched. The study was conducted again by 2 biologists, and the biologists actually simulated harvest. And by that, what I mean by that is that they went into the field. These 2 young women who did the study lived on South Marble Island for most of the summer. And they harvested eggs. They simulated harvest, and luckily we were able to take those eggs that they collected for the scientific study and bring them over to Hoona and distribute them in Hoona. So, although Hoona folks as of yet have not been able to pick the eggs themselves, they did get at least for 2 years to eat eggs that were harvested in Glacier Bay. And the biologists also looked at the physical condition of males and females. What they found was that, yes, harvest could take place without impacting gull populations, especially if the harvest took place early on in the season, so early in June, and if the harvest took place at a discrete point in time. So those of you, again, who know that many people used to go to Glacier Bay repetitively and gather eggs are going to ask, well, what's different now? You know, why are you saying that now we have to only go early on? What's different now is that successional processes have taken place. Even in just the last 100 years, South Marble Island has become really heavily vegetated, where there used to be just gentle rolling slopes with a little bit of grass, ideal nesting habitat for gulls. We now have little patches of grass and big patches of shrubbery and big patches actually of trees now. So the landscape has changed, and with that, the gull populations have changed. So there are many fewer gulls now than there used to be. So we have to take that into consideration. In the intervening years, some other things that took place that have actually helped this process along. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was finally amended in 1997, and it was amended actually to accommodate the needs of Alaska Native people specifically, not just the Tlingit people, but the Inuit and the Inupiaq and Athabascan peoples who also rely on eggs of a variety of species. So the act was amended. It now allows for egg collecting by Native people. And in fact, the ethnographic work that was collected by Dr. Thornton and Dr. Hun and others was really instrumental in having the amendment include the opportunity for Hoona people to harvest. So when the amendment was passed, the Park Service recognized that even though harvest could still not take place within Glacier Bay National Park because of Park Service regulations, it could take place outside of the national park. So the Park Service assisted the folks from Hoona in harvesting eggs at Middle Pass Rock, which is a gull egg colony outside of the park. In 2001, 2002, and 2003. And here in this photograph, you can see a young man from Hoona. He's got his 5-gallon bucket, and he's clambering all over Mill Pass Rock, collecting eggs. So again, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act amendment has allowed for harvest outside of the park. And then another regulation that was passed in 2000, it was introduced by then Senator Murkowski. It was primarily focused on commercial fishing in Glacier Bay, but it also requested that the Park Service assess the potential impacts of egg harvest collection, and requires that the Park Service introduce legislation to try to authorize gull egg collection. So that may be one of the few things that Senator Murkowski has done that the Hoona Tlingit people are happy about. My politics aren't showing, I hope. So with that legislation to back us up, the National Park Service asked if I would come back on staff to oversee what's called a legislative environmental impact statement process. And it's basically a legal process that's required for any federal agency before they implement a new activity. So we started that process just this past year. Myself, Ken Grant, Stephanie Zador, who is the biologist who did the gull egg, the gull work, and Jamie Womble, another biologist, are on that team. And you can see here Ken pointing out very carefully to the biologist that her numbers are not correct. This legal process requires that the Park Service look at the full range of issues the full range of topics that the public might bring up to us. So obviously we're looking at how would gull egg harvest affect gull populations, other seabirds. So this is a photograph of South Marble Island, and South Marble Island supports lots of glaucous wing gulls. That's the GWGU that you see. It also supports black-legged kittiwakes, the BLKI that you see the little arrow pointing there, pigeon guillemots, and common murres. So we have to take into account the effects of egg harvest on those other species. South Marble Island also now supports a gigantic colony of stellar sea lions. Again, the Huna folks tell us that they have a really good way to take care of that as well. But that's coming down the road, maybe. And there are also harbor seals in the area that could potentially be impacted by harvest activities. But most importantly, what this legal analysis does is it's a way for us, the National Park Service and Huna Indian Association, to show the public the importance of egg harvest and egg consumption to the cultural traditions of the Huna people. And this is Ken and his sister Alice, and they're at Ganacha with their seagull regalion. The document looks at three alternatives. The first alternative is no action, which is a required alternative. It means if this alternative were selected, the Park Service would not allow gull harvest to take place. That's a required alternative. A second alternative looks at authorizing harvest to take place at two locations, South Marble Island, and a second alternative that the Huna people could select themselves. And then the third alternative would allow a couple of additional locations to be harvested from and much more harvest. So those three alternatives are being analyzed. Right now, I'll let you know that the Park Service's preferred alternative is the third alternative. The current superintendent, Tommy Lee, is very, very supportive of reauthorizing egg harvest in the park. She really wants to bridge the gap between the folks in Huna and the Park Service. So she is looking at trying to authorize as much egg harvest as she possibly can. Our process, we're hoping to complete this legal document sometime this summer. After that is completed, we will have to actually write regulations. That's just the legal wording that would allow egg harvest. We will have to introduce legislation, and we're hoping that Senator Lisa Murkowski, will assist in that process. So those of you who have contacts with Senator Murkowski, you may wish to bring this up with her and have discussions with her about it. And that would mean that the first legal harvest that could take place in Glacier Bay would be next summer, the June of 2008. So we hope that the next one of these meetings we have, Ken will be coming to talk with you about the 800 dozen eggs that he and the folks from Huna collected. So, questions or comments?
Gathering of eggs is allowed.
That's a really good question. The question was when egg harvest is allowed, who will be able to go and harvest? Because because Glacier Bay is Huna Tlingit territory, Huna Indian Association, the federally recognized tribal government, will be the organization that authorizes the people who go. So HIA will will work with the community to select representative folks to go and do that harvest.
I live in
And now I'm going to introduce Bert Adams, who has been patiently waiting for his turn. We're going to move from Glacier Bay a little bit north to Yakutat. And Bert is going to be talking about another traditional ecological knowledge project with the East Alsek River Sockeye project. So I'll turn it over to Bert.
Yakutat Guna chish hat good day. Kada shan ka nuts keek too yukudu asak. Yech na chatsati kluk na khadi ayachat. Guna khu kwan ayachat. Ich hit dach ayachat. Sheetka kagon tanyari ayachat. Sheetka kiksari ka Swedish dashkan ayachat. I'm going to, because of the time constraints, I'm going to skip the story about the birth of Raven. Because if I was going to share the story of the birth of Raven to you, I would have to rush through it and it would take all of the flavor of this great story off. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Raven's creations. This is a Gunahu story, a dry base story. And it was given to me by my grandmother when I was going to school at Mount Edgecombe. When school was out in the spring, we would go out to the Aquay River and we would fish there, and we'd stay there all summer and then come back and go to school in the fall. But in the spring, I would always spend maybe 2 or 3 days with my grandma Minnie. And she would feed me all of my favorite foods, and then she would tell me some of these stories. She told me a lot of them, but I never really paid any attention to them, you know, just being a teenager, interested more in girls and other things, you know. And I kicked myself all around for not being able to record those stories that she told me. But some of them, you know, I began to recall, and a lot of them, the information that she provided in De Laguna is under Mount St. Elias. We're also there too, and so I'd read that and I'd say, oh yeah, I remember that story. And so I'm going to be sharing some of Raven's creations in Gunahu. After Raven was born, his mother took very good care of him, and she would bathe him in cold seawater twice a day so that he could grow fast and become strong. And as he began to mature a little bit more, he began to hunt the small animals with a bow and arrow. And he learned to be an expert hunter. And also, when he became a little bit more older, he killed a very large white bird. And his mother skinned it out for him, and she put it around him. And from that point on, Raven developed a desire to fly. There's a lot of funny stories about how he would practice taking off and landing, crashing into things and everything. But he managed to learn how to master flying real well after a bit. And it got to a point where he was able to fly at lightning speed. And by the time that he had mastered that, then he was ready to go and provide a place for the Tlingit people to live. But he needed these elements in order for him to place the Tlingit people on this land first. He needed to have air, which is already there. He needed to have heen, fresh water, fire, and food. So Raven had the ability to be able to not create things, but to organize things. You know, Herman gave a very interesting point here earlier that we need to respect the resources that we have. Tlingits and Native Americans believe that there is life in everything. There is life in the trees, there's life in the rocks, there's life in you and I. And also, you know, science backs that up. If you've taken science in high school or college, you learn all about these atoms and neutrons and electrons and everything. Those are things that are alive. And so if you live a good life, as Herman said, these resources will provide themselves for you to help you sustain your lives. And so he was able to create a place or organize a place for the Tlingit people to live. And I heard this story by A.P. Johnson when I was going to school at Mount Edgecombe. And he tells a story about how raven caused the land to come up from the water. And one of the big landmarks that came up was Wasaitasha. Today we know it as Mount St. Elias. And then the other mountain, Plasan. Today we know it as Mount Fairweather. And then the mountains in between them, they began to have children, and it separated them further and further apart until today they now live over 200 miles from one another, and the only time that they can see each other is when the weather is clear. And so Raven then etched out all of the places where the lakes and the rivers and streams were going to be. And then he knew that he had to find an island where petrel lived. And so he began to fly out onto the ocean, lightning speeds. And when he found this island, he saw that petrel was guarding this well that had fresh water in it very closely. He had a real big te, or boulder on it. And then he sat on top of it and protected it. And then he would not let Raven have any of that water, even no matter how much Raven begged or coaxed him, he would not let him have it. So then begins the story of how Raven began to do tricks in order to get what he wanted. So he rubbed some dog excrement on petrel when he was asleep at night. And then he woke him up and he says, Akani, Akani, what is the matter with you? You must be ill. And Petrel woke up and he smelled awful, something like gink, I guess. And so he ran down to the ocean to wash himself off, and while he was doing that, Raven took the large boulder off the well and he dove down in there and he took great big gulps of fresh water. And then he flew out of that well and he flew over to the mainland, and he was flying between Wasaitasha and Tlasan. And as he was flying there, drops of water fell out of his beak and into the mountains and onto the land where the lakes and the rivers were formed. And so we have the Situk River, the Enclave, Dangerous, Italia, Aquay, and Alsac. The next thing that he did is he flew out into the ocean again, a long, long way out, further than from the first island. And he came upon this island that had mountains that were blowing out fire. This is my own belief, but I think that it was probably Hawaii. And he picked up a little twig that was burning, and then he flew back to the mainland. And as he was flying between the mountains, little drops of cinders fell onto the ground, and it fell into the rocks and into the wood. And that's why when you strike two rocks together, it will spark, and if you hold it close enough to a gun or wood, it'll burst into flame. So now we have fresh water and fire. The next thing that Raven needed to do is he needed to provide food for the people. And he was flying, between the two mountains again, and admiring his handiwork. And he was flying. The other day I was flying from Yakutat to Juneau. And I'll be showing some slides here about that, about the Dry Bay area or the Gunahu area. But we flew over the Gunahu area, and I was looking out the window, and between Aquay and the Dry Bay area, I could imagine him looking out, flying, 420 miles an hour, 27,000 feet, and looking out into the ocean. He saw this thing bobbing out in the ocean. So he zipped out there, and he realized that as he got closer, that this was a large canoe that had a real big house on top of it. And when he got closer enough to investigate what was inside, he saw that this is where the animals and the birds and the fishes were. Okay, so he flew back to the mainland, and he took out, cut down some alders, some gish. He carved out 2 long staffs that were fashioned after the arms of an octopus, and he even put those little suckers on it. Then he flew back out into that large canoe, and he stuck it on there, and he began to tow that large canoe to shore. And when he got to shore, he got up onto the beach, and he pulled that large canoe up onto the dry land, and he let out all of the animals and the birds and the fishes. And he had the salmon in compartments. There was the king salmon, the sockeye, the humpies, and the dog salmon and cohos, and he let them all out at different times. First the king salmon, the sockeye, and so forth. And that's how come we have these various seasons. Excuse me. So after he lets out the animals and the birds and the fishes into the sea, he takes off this house from the large canoe, and he places it about halfway up the Aquay River. And this is known as Diganahit, far out house, because he pulled it in from far out. That was the first tribal house that was placed on a site called Guseak. And then he was able now to place the Tlingit people in that area. And he put them on that site on Guseak, and he gave them his tribal house. And then he told them that these resources that I provided for you are yours for your benefit, and you need to treat them with respect. You must not use more than what you need. You must not waste it. And you must share it with other people. Share it with your friends. And so Gunahu became a very plentiful resource for many people. And even the people from the interior used to come down along the SOK River, and they would hunt and fish there. People from southeast used to go up there, and those resources were plentiful, that it supplied many people with all of the things that they needed, hundreds of people. And later on, when I talk about the East Alsac, that whole area can't even supply even 100 people, with the resources they need today. Okay, let me show you some slides. Wasay Tasha. This is Mount St. Elias. And this is the Yakutat area. And you can see the landing right over there, the runway. That's where Raven practiced taking off and taking off and landing. Okay. Plaswan, Mount Fairweather, and that's the Gunahu area. And I don't have a pointer, but I'm going to go up here and I'm going to show you something. Pay attention right there. I'm going to show a photo of that later on. This is the Yakutat area, and that square part of it over there is Gunahu. Uh-oh, something's wrong here. Okay, and then this is Gunahu. And like I said, I don't have the pointer, but I'll use my finger. The Aquay River, and it goes up this way, and then goes around and winds, and then goes up, or it comes down this way. There's a mouth here. That number 1 spot there is the site of Gusayak, where he put in the first tribal house. There is Raven. When he pulled up, it's a large canoe with the house on it. If you notice, there's trees that come up and down from the mouth, and then there's this little sandy area there, and then trees are starting again. That sandy area is where, I'm sorry, that sandy area is where Raven put his footprints into the sand when he pulled that ark up onto the shore and let the animals out. It's called Yech Ayawu Gude, Gudiye. The site of Gusayak right there. That's the village. When I think it was 19. Oh, I'm having a little trouble here, folks. It's not going right for me. Yeah, I need to go back.
Far back.
Not there, somewhere. Back. Another one. More. Can I go back?
Yep, keep going back that way.
The search for Gusayak. Several years ago, I wrote an article for one of the, it's called the Alaska Native magazine, I think it was, run by Huna Totem at one time. And it was called The Lost Village of Gusayak. And I told in it a story about how we used to fish in the Dry Bay area. And then we moved over to Aquay in 1950. And when my grandmother, Minnie, found out that we were going to fish over there, she pulled me and my brother aside, and she told us about the village of Gusayak. And the last time that she saw it was 40 years ago. This was in 1950. So that takes it back to about 1910. And I remember my research, of the Gunahu area, the last potlatch that was held there was in 1909. And she was a little girl, and she described these tribal houses that were there. She said that they were already falling down, and that moss was covering them all up already. And so she challenged me and my brother to look for it. And so for 16 years, we ran up and down the banks of the Aquay River looking for Gusayak. And then in 1997, I was working for the Yakutat Tlingit tribe then, and the Forest Service and National Park Service and the tribe sponsored a trip down to the Dry Bay area. And we took about 14 people from Gunahu, elders who had grown up there, for the purpose of trying to remember place names and jerking their history, about that area a little bit more, memories of that. And we found a site that was over 180 years old, and it was sunk down into the ground, okay? And so I went over to Wayne Howell, who was, with us on that trip, and another archaeologist from the Forest Service. And I said, hey, you know what? I bet you if we went to Aquay, I can take you to Gusayak. And so the next year, we made a trip over there, and sure enough, I took them right to it. and we knew what to look for then. Before, we were looking for actual structures, and now we were looking for evidence in the ground. And so we found Glisaic, some of the tribal houses there, and that's me, okay? And I am sleeping. We're taking a rest. That's one of the sites of the tribal house. This was Mountain House, as I understand it, because my grandma Minnie said that Mountain House was about a quarter of a mile up from the other tribal houses. And so this is the one that we found. The next day, the others were 4 other tribal houses were found down about a quarter of a mile away down there. And this is one of the sites also that was a tribal house. You see that mound there. In 2005, we went down there on a trip, and of course Herman was with us, and the other Herman, I don't see him here, and we took the St. Elias dancers with us, just 6 of them, and they danced the dry bay dance for us, and it was the first drum beats heard in the Gunahu area for about 100 years. Commercial fishing began in the Gunahu area, and you can see evidence of those posts sticking out of the ground. When I was fishing there in the 1960s, they were much higher, and now they're almost down into the ground. But that's evidence of a train that used to go out on toward the bay, toward Dry Bay. There was a train that ran from Gunahu to Akwe, about 12 or 13 miles long, and this is some evidence. This is one of the trains, or the train that was out there. Very good condition. George Ramus keeps saying that we need to take that out of there and put it in a museum somewhere, and it's going to be pretty expensive to do that. But I think it's something that we need to seriously think about. That's my wife, Klekwatsi. She was with us, and if you can see the railroad tracks, she's standing right in the middle of them. Over 100 years old, folks. Some boilers, some machineries. Now I'd like to talk about the East Alsac River. The East Alsac River is only maybe not even 100 years old. What it did is it broke off from the Alsac River. And it created an environment for sockeye salmon and other salmon as well. But during the 1980s and 90s, there were some of the most productive sockeye. That was one of the most productive sockeye rivers in the Gunahu area. And in the mid-1990s, it crashed. And they had to close down commercial fishing and kept it open. I think even subsistence fishing, wasn't allowed there for a while. And so what the Yakutat Tlingit tribe did was got together with the National Park Service, the Forest Service, the corporation, the city and borough of Yakutat, and decided that we were going to do some projects that would try to find out what happened out there. And the very first project that we did was a TEK project. The purpose for that was to gather information to document how our people used to manage their resources. We hired a local native girl who was an anthropologist, and she did that study for us. And then when it came time to do management schemes, for that area, then we can bridge it with Western science. And where can you go wrong when you document the ways that our people managed their resources in the past? They did have methods and means of managing our resources, and they always came back plentiful. Quickly now, I'm going to skip ahead. All this says is just what I had already said about the reasons for doing a TAK project. And then they did 4 of them. What I'd like to do now is spend the next couple of minutes talking something about the natural laws. When I was in college, I took this Native American Studies class, and our instructor was a Native American, and there was about 40 of us in the classroom, maybe about this size, and he came in at the very last, and the first thing he did was he introduced himself, and then he wrote the word nature on the board, and then he drew a circle around it, and then he asked us, individually to think about it for 10 or so minutes, and then he wanted to get our responses. So we did that. I was sitting way in the back, and he started from the back first and worked his way up to the front. Gave each and every one of us an opportunity to respond. And of course, there were about 40 different answers. And then he went on and explained it himself. He says, a long time ago, before the Pilgrims ever came here, we lived with nature. And because we lived with nature, we understood the laws of nature. And because we understood the laws of nature, we obeyed the laws of nature. And because we obeyed the laws of nature, nature provided us with everything that we needed. Exactly what Herman Kitka said a little while ago. And then he went on he drew these arrows, from the outside of the circle to the circle, and he asked us, to respond to that. And then, most of us got the answer correctly, but the real answer, he says, is that these outside arrows are the influences that were on eventually to come in, and their purpose was to get in there and to conquer. And when they eventually did, it caused this imbalance, this clash of cultures, this thing that we are still trying to recover from today. And then he says, by the time that we finish, this class, that we may be able to have the answers and how we can start living within that circle of nature again. Natural laws are something that cannot be repealed. It stands the test of time and cannot be changed. It is predictable under certain conditions and circumstances. And they are things as they really are, as opposed to the way that we ourselves would like to see them. We have to take a reality check every now and then and take ourselves away from our own feelings and our own little prejudices and see things as they really are. It also includes Tlingit values. In other words, respecting everything. Take only what you need. Use everything and don't waste. And also to share. So the principles of the natural laws is when we live with nature, we learn to understand the laws of nature, and I already explained that. Let's move on. The Gunurhukwans consist of Kluknachadis, Klukachadis, and Shangokwadis. In 2001, we made a trip over there. I already explained that, and these are some of the people that went. There's about 14 people. And then these are some Gunahau men: Fred White, Vincent Johnson, Sigurd Edwards, George Ramus, and of course, myself. In 2005, we made another trip to Gunahu, and we spent 3 days there. And the 2 Hermans came up and visited us. And those are some of the most beautiful days that the Creator gave to us to enjoy not only them, but also to connect with our ancestral areas. And there's a Kukahadi lady and her husband. She went too. Well, they both came. The end.
There are a couple quick questions for Bert. We went through lots of interesting things, some traditional stories, some background information about the East Alsek River issues, and then their rediscovery of Gusei. Any questions for Bert? If not right now, he'll be around, I think, for the rest of the meeting, right?
Sure, you bet.
Okay, good. Thank you, Bert. Okay, our last speaker tonight, and actually before I introduce her, I should let you know, the gentleman who just came in and whispered to us asked us to let you know that the elder van will be leaving from just out front as soon as Betsy's talk is over, so that'll be probably in about 20 minutes. So those of you who would like to catch the elder van, you can look for it right in the front of the building as soon as this talk is over. So thank you very much for that. Betsy Kunibi is going to be talking with us about traditional gardening practices. It's not something that we hear lots about. We hear lots about traditional harvesting and hunting and fishing and gathering, but we don't hear about the potatoes that go with that dried fish. That naivety is not naivety unless you have potatoes to go with it. So Betsy is going to share with us some of the research that she's been doing about traditional potato growing methods and some of the discoveries that she's made about that. Thank you.
Sisku tla yuchat duasak tlet ka einach Elizabeth Kunibi yuchat duasak yechnach hatsiti kiksadi ayachat Irish yadi hatsiti Magyar Dutch hun ayachat ka Irish Dutch hun ayachat. Okay. So as we're all getting hungry, we'll start on some more food. And I'll just get right into this. Potato gardening of the Tlingit and Haida people of the Northwest Coast. Potatoes have been grown, nurtured, and traded by Tlingit people and other Northwest Coast native people for many years. Two varieties of potato presently being grown in Alaska have been traced back in history for many generations. The first, considered the Tlingit potato, is called Maria's potato, and the other, considered a Haida potato, called the Kusan potato. There's also a potato called the Ozette that's been grown by the Makah Nation probably for over 150 years. The potatoes originally from South America, Peru. This is Yakutat, of course. I flew over it and I thought it was very interesting that they had a total mix of areas where there was no vegetation and then vegetation, so that you could get an idea of the beginnings of the soil after the glaciers had retreated several times. Wild tubers were harvested in Peru 12,000 years ago. And these potatoes from South America are probably the potatoes that have turned up here. There's thousands of varieties, and they're genetically distinct from one another. There's more than 6,000 varieties being cultivated in the Andean countries of South America today. This is a comparison of a couple growing areas. The farm on the left is in Palmer, and the garden on the right is in the Juneau area. And at that garden, Colt Island, we are also growing Maria's potato. Southeast Alaska has an early history of gardens, and potatoes were mentioned as early as 1765 through oral and written histories of Tlingit and Haida people, as well as documents from Russian, Spanish, and American ships. Prior to this time, potato gardens may have been introduced into Southeast through trade along the Northwest coast. The early potato varieties are much smaller than today's modern potato and would be easier to transport as a trade item. Here's the comparative example of why Southeast gardens were underrepresented in the literature. Most of the early gardens of the Tlingit were on islands and southern facing. They required canoe access and often had rock walls behind them that retained heat. It was in the vegetation strands below the forest and above the high tide line that potatoes were grown, intermingling with indigenous vegetation. So again, here's how the potatoes could have arrived here from South America, either by trade or after the Europeans came. The Spanish explorers were coming up from South America as well as down from Europe, and the Russian explorers and fur traders also came from South America as well as Russia. And potatoes would have been a very easy thing to transport on the ships. This is a photograph of a woman harvesting potatoes in 1905. It's from an unknown location, although Steve Henriksen said maybe possibly from the building we could tell where it was from. So here she is harvesting her potatoes, and you'll notice that she has a stick, which is a very important gardening tool, called a digging stick. And there's two varieties of potatoes presently being grown in Alaska, which is the Marias and the Kasan. Tlingit gardens were often traveled to. Many of the village sites didn't have gardens, but they would travel, the Tlingit people would travel off to the islands where they did have gardens. An example of that would be the Indian Islands, where some Huna people would travel, as well as the village site in Huna also had gardens. They were usually planted in the spring with seaweed as a fertilizer. And then often they didn't even have to return at any time during the summer. They could just go back in the fall. Here's a picture from Oral Krause's book in the late 1800s of two women in Huna planting potatoes, and they often did have big fields of potatoes because they traded potatoes with other different Tlingit groups, as well as storing them for the winter. According to Nancy Turner and her extensive study of the indigenous plant foods of the British Columbia Native people, she states, the Haida were proficient at growing potatoes and sold them not only to the Tsimshian of the adjacent mainland, but to passing fur trading ships into the Hudson's Bay Company as well. Some recall seeing Haida canoes, some Haida elders recall seeing Haida canoes laden almost to the gunwales with potatoes, heading across the treacherous waters of Hecata Strait en route to the Nass and Skeena rivers to trade with the Tsimshian for Yulacon grease and other products. John Skadans, an early Haida potato planter, said they would be harvested when the dog salmon come up the river and their heads turned white. By 1850, barrels of potatoes were being shipped to Hawaii from Sitka along with timber. And you'll see she also has a digging stick. So these are the gardening tools. This is a close-up of one. This gardening tool is in the collection at the Alaska State Museum, and it was a gift of Harris Natkong of Heidelberg in 1951. And he said this tool was used by his mother. You can also see that the tip of it, or the pointish part, was forged out of a copper spike, which could have come up in one of the boat wreckages. And this is sketches done by Emmons in about 1892. These are several pictures of harvesting implements. And it's a digging stick, a paddle-shaped digging spade, and a foot spade, which is the stick with the flat square at the end that you could push into the ground with pressure from your foot. This woman is gathering sedge rhizomes, and the rhizomes were then washed at the water's edge, and you can notice the tip of her digging stick, which is made of mountain mahogany, is fire hardened. This digging stick is from the collection at Nez Perce National Historical Park. The camas bulb, much like the salmon, has significance for the Nez Perce beyond its value as a source of vitamins and minerals. Camas is a sacred food. The bulbs are still harvested using tukes, which are the digging sticks. The long curved stick of the tukes is used for loosening the soil and gently removing the roots, bulbs, and other plants from the ground. This one is made of fire-hardened yew and a handle of bone. However, historically, they could also be made from the horns of the bighorn sheep. They still follow the time-honored design to ensure that not a great deal of soil was disturbed and to make the field look as though no one had been there. And they're designed to only harvest one root at a time, not like a big shovel where you would go and disturb the land. And these are 2 digging sticks of the Navajo people. This is a storage hut. This is from Kodiak. And in this historic photo, which was taken about 1919, the caption said that the native people of Kodiak had been gardening for over 100 years. At least that is what was known before that, gardening potatoes. And this is gathering seaweed, again in Kodiak. And referring to the potato gathering of Southeast Emmons states in 1892, after being gathered, the potatoes are stored in cellars, under the floor, or in root houses. They were generally cooked by steaming in a ground oven or on a hearth of heated stone and covered with seaweed, which not only confined the steam, but also contributed salt and were eaten with grease. Now we go to Glacier Bay. This is a recent photograph of a garden area in Glacier Bay, and I had done seal research in Glacier Bay for 7 years, and when I started working with the anthropology group, I wasn't too excited about this area and didn't really even believe it was a garden because I knew Glacier Bay was young, and this particular garden area was gardened in the 1900s and before. So the this garden research that I've been doing began during a 2003 field class in Glacier Bay, the archaeology of Glacier Bay, and one of the tasks was just to map an historical village belonging to the Tlingit people of Glacier Bay. And it began by looking at Robert Ackerman's 1963 map and description of the area. Ackerman's map was an unsurveyed, hand-drawn map showing, among other features, an area marked as a potato plot, documented as growing potatoes beginning in the late 1800s. And here's another view of that potato site. We located the garden mounds identified on the map, and Ackerman's report states undoubtedly a garden plot. Standing at the garden site about 40 years after Ackerman and about 100 years since it was gardened, there was still some form to it. 2 mounds running parallel to the beach that was over 40 feet away due to glacial rebound, making the garden further up into the forest's edge. The mounds were about 4 feet high, 5 feet apart, and 20 feet long. There was thick plant growth and some young trees about 30 to 40 years old. The garden was close to the beachfront, and the mounding could also have acted like a berm during storms to protect the area from overwash during high tides or storms. So after observing those gardens and realizing potatoes were a big part of the Tlingit people diet, I had someone talk to me and said that their grandparents were growing some potatoes. And I at first didn't think that that would have anything to do with the garden research we did in Glacier Bay. But he kept telling me, call my grandparents, call my grandparents. So I did call his grandparents, and they turned out to be Richard and Nora Dauenhauer. So I realized his grandparents' potatoes could be something rare. From left to right is Chuck Brown, and then Richard, the gardener, and then myself and daughter. Richard and Nora grow a potato that Nora named Maria after her friend that gave her the potatoes to grow many years ago. This is a cultivar that's passed from generation to generation for possibly over 100 years. The Dauenhauers and I wondered if Maria's potato would reveal some information or history to us through its DNA. So the plan for Maria's potato was to find someone who could analyze the DNA, and we might be able to trace it back to its place of origin. Chuck Brown, the person on the left, is the principal investigator for the National Science Foundation Potato Genome Project. Their project goals include to conduct fundamental research on the potato and other solanaceous plants, and to foster science education and public awareness of plant genomics. And Chuck spent over 10 years in the Andes in Mexico studying potatoes and their DNA, and he keeps all these records, as well as there's a World Bank of the DNA. So he's a plant geneticist with the Agricultural Research Service and came to Juneau to examine this potato. This is a basket of ozette potatoes, and the ozette potato is identified also as a primitive cultivar, which means a cultivated variety. And it was being grown down in Washington by the Makah Nation. And we thought Maria's could be related to this particular potato, or be exactly the same. We also wanted to compare them all with each other, as well as comparing them to a database of South American varieties. From this, we would establish their relationship to each other, as well as their possible origin, because you can't tell just by looking at the potato where it's from. These are the hands of Dr. Joe Cool and Chuck, two plant geneticists with the Agricultural Research Service. This was taken in a garden on the Kenai Peninsula at Nikolaevsk village, where we're looking at their potatoes. They're cutting open this potato to see inside. And these are the insides of a lot of different varieties of potato, and you could see how different they are. Potatoes can also look different from one another and still be genetically identical. This is because each plant's exposed to different viruses transmitted mechanically or by insect, nematode, or fungal vectors, causing them to look different when they grow. And they would get this from the different soils that they would grow in by having that vector. Due to this, it's almost impossible to tell by looking at the plant if they're the same, unless there are pigmentation differences in the flowers. And also these viruses, they don't affect us, and we can't see them on the potatoes. So if you do have potatoes, they might have them, but they're just latent and they don't bother. And then here we also have many different varieties of the inside of some other potatoes. And I know that, and when I read some Tlingit stories about the different potatoes and the oral histories of the kind they were eating, there's a lot of different descriptions. Primitive cultivars are potatoes that have not been altered or modernized, have a different look than a potato planted in most agricultural endeavors today. They usually have more eyes, and some may be oblong and finger-shaped. Along the potato, there's a helical spiral pattern coiling around it. Just like on a tree, you would see the branches going up the side of the tree. And this is more pronounced on a primitive cultivar or a cultivated variety that hasn't been enhanced by modern breeding practices. I also obtained another potato we call the Kassan potato. I read an article by Julie Coburn titled Seed Potatoes in Foxgloves. She mentioned growing a potato bought to Old Kassan. Her aunt and a friend canoed to Puget Sound or Victoria and returned with enough potatoes to plant. This was over 100 years ago. Julie Coburn still grows these today and gave some to Chuck Brown to test and compare with the Ozettes and the Maria potatoes. So those were the two Alaskan potatoes that we actually have that have been growing here for over 100 years. This is a chart the geneticist sent us showing the results of the DNA test on the leaves. What they do is they plant the potato, grow it, and then extract the DNA from the leaves rather than the potato itself, which is too starchy. We wanted a simple way we could tell. If all these peaks were all lined up and all the same, then that would mean that all the potatoes were exactly the same. And they have 14 sequences that they do. It's pretty much, the test is similar to a paternity test that a person would be given. So when these didn't match up, we knew on the 6th sequence that we had a new potato, which was the Kassan, as well as Maria's. So the Maria's potato, the Ozette, and the Kassan are all distinct. This is important because modern crop potatoes that were developed through a series of selections to emphasize yield, often at the expense of insect or disease resistance or environmental intolerance. These early cultivars are more resistant to insects and disease, and it makes them a valuable potato not to lose in retaining plant diversity. Potatoes aren't like seeds. If you have a bad year and you lose your crop, you might not have any to plant the next year. Now these plants are being kept alive so that if we do have a bad season, you have a place to turn to get some more of these cultivars. And these are two maps. You can see the side-by-side, the Marias and the Ozette, as well as the Casan potato, probably originated either in Chile, which would be at the tip of South America, or in Mexico. They didn't have the exact Peruvian markers, which is closer because from Chile then they would have been more at sea level. And then in the very center, I'll just point to it briefly. Those are the Alaskan potatoes, and all the other potatoes are the South American. So you could see the isolated Alaskan potatoes. They've probably been isolated for quite some time. So the conclusions are, it would appear fairly certain that the Ozette and Marias don't come from the Central Andes, and the Ozette and Marias are closely related but not the same. And the Mexican and Chilean potatoes are possible sources. And the Casan came after I made this slide. We got the results. So the Ozette, Marias, and Casan are all would fit into this category. And this is a photograph from 1911 from the Klukwan School Garden. And you can see that the children there have quite an armload of vegetables. This picture was from a volume of Agroborealis, a newsletter published by the Agricultural Research Service. The school's displaying the school's bounty, a yield from the school garden of 55 sacks of potatoes, 500 pounds of turnips and rutabagas, besides lettuce, peas, parsnips, carrots, beets, cabbage, etc. So when I look at this photograph and plus back at those digging sticks, as well as planting gardens, these are some practices that can start to be done again. Especially with the digging sticks, that seems like something that the summer camps and the people that are working with the children can start either making some of those as they get back into more plants. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions. We could have some plant starts sent to us, and if anybody is really that interested, then just talk to me at some time during the conference. And these are the thank yous to some of the scientists as well as the Tlingit people that provided the plants. And the reason one's a Tlingit potato and one's a Haida potato is because of the families that were still growing these. And there's probably more out there somewhere. Thank you.